I will share my screen there.
Okay. Well, shall I just introduce you first, Ella, before you do that? Let me get my notes up.
Oh, yeah, sure. Do you want me to take my screen off, or are you happy for me to leave it on while you introduce me?
That can stay. That's fine.
Great.
So before we hand over to Ella, let's just formally introduce her and tell you all about her research. So Dr. Ella Houston is a senior lecturer in disability studies and is a core member of the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies at Liverpool Hope University in the UK. Her research, which explores representations of disability in advertising, is published in the Journal of Advertising, Media Culture and Society, Disability and Society, and the International Review of Qualitative Research. She recently guest edited a special issue of the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, focusing on approaches to disability and diversity in contemporary advertising, with her colleague, Professor Beth Haller. Dr. Houston, as well as being an academic, is a trustee for Daisy Inclusive UK, a charity that offers community education and employment support to disabled people. And she's also a mentor for the Girls Network, which is a national organisation that offers mentoring and networking opportunities to girls from the least advantaged communities. So I'm going to hand over to Ella today, who's going to be talking to us about her research. And thank you very much. We'll have time for questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you once again for having me present as part of the Documents Research Network. I'm really happy to be here. My presentation will focus on the ways in which advertisements evoke metanarratives and counternarratives surrounding mental health. My cultural disability studies research examines various barriers in culture, such as problematic representations and stigmatizing attitudes that face people who have impairments and/or experience mental health issues. Cultural disability studies is a discipline that analyses the ways in which culture constructs disability, combining cultural studies focus on the role that cultural norms, in quotes, and ideologies play in reinforcing social and political inequalities, with disability studies expose of societal barriers, such as inaccessible environments and social policies that focus on so-called special needs rather than human rights that disable people who have impairments. Cultural disability studies develops key ideas from disability studies, arguing that we cannot expect social policies, buildings, educational systems, and so on to become more inclusive if we do not also challenge the cultural representations that shape the attitudes and ideas that underpin them. If you want to find out more, which I'd be very happy if you did, please make sure you check out the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies YouTube channel and Facebook page. I've included links on this slide. My approach to analysing representations of disability in advertising is informed by David Bolt's concept of cultural stations. And if you're interested in the concept of cultural stations, if you go to my reference list, the book Finding Blindness I think you'll find that particularly interesting. That's where the idea of cultural stations is introduced. So cultural stations are overtly, but not exclusively, textual or social, historical or contemporary, local or global, unique or universal, positive or negative, end quotes. In other words, cultural stations are texts or their interactions or places that play a foundational role in shaping our personal understandings of disability. For example, many disabled people resent how charity advertising acts as a cultural station for the vast majority of non-disabled people. Due to exposure to portrayals of disability in pity-provoking charities advertising, many non-disabled people problematically associate impairments with loss and tragedy. My research uses advertisements as sources of data. The themes I discuss in this presentation are drawn from a larger project that I am currently working on. And that's a book that I'm writing that examines past and present representations of disability in different kinds of advertising, from charity appeals to the rising trend of pro-diversity or so-called activist brand promotions. More broadly speaking, text-based approaches are popular in cultural disability studies research, as they do not require any time or energy from disabled participants. Many people with impairments are deeply suspicious of researchers because they have dedicated their time, efforts, and stories to research, receiving little in return. Historically, research has focused on medical problems and scientific solutions, in scare quotes, to disability, paying little attention to the socio-cultural forms of discrimination faced by disabled people in their everyday lives. In other words, there's been a lot of research that has been done on disabled people, taking disabled people's time, but not tackled the issues that disabled people feel are most important in their lives. As Amy Grant highlights, using documents as data in research can also promote accessibility for disabled academics, especially as the vast majority of documents can now be accessed electronically and online. So now I want to think more specifically about how advertising promotes meta-narratives of disability to mass markets. And again, if you're interested in the concept of meta-narratives, you can find the reference for Bolt's edited collection, which my colleague Erin Pritchard, who's here today, has a chapter in my reference list, Meta-narratives of Disability. David Bolt uses the term meta-narratives to refer to widespread, sweeping stories about disability, specific impairments, and health conditions. Meta-narratives are taken for granted, in quotes, notions and universal ideas that are reflected in and reinforced by stock characters. So, for example, in cultural texts such as literature, television, film, art, you'll have stock characters such as the so-called blind beggar, the neurotic, anxious woman, or the autistic genius. Stock characters often appear in advertising because they can be easily recognised by mass markets. Also, bear in mind that advertising content reflects advertisers' culturally situated knowledge and backgrounds. Advertising, in particular, is prone to promoting meta-narratives of disability because it tends to favour sensationalist, attention-grabbing taglines and images over in-depth, nuanced information. For instance, this slide features a print advertisement produced as part of the NHS's Help Us, Help You mental health campaign. The advert includes a close-up image of a woman of colour with the message, "Help, I need somebody," in bold, white writing across her face. And the smaller text explains that the NHS is here to help. So while the bold and direct message, "Help, I need someone," is likely to capture people's attention, and that's what advertisers want, right? To capture people's attention, to stand out amongst masses of other advertisements. So while it's good in capturing attention, it also has a dramatizing effect that can evoke a sense of fear and desperation, encouraging patronizing and stigmatizing associations with mental health issues. It's important, I believe, to consider how the meta-narrative of mental illness is reinforced in advertisements, as advertising plays a pervasive role in the majority of people's lives. Many people are exposed, often unknowingly, to thousands of advertisements each day. as they go about their daily lives, going shopping, spending time online, watching television, using public transport. Advertising is a vast and fast-moving aspect of popular culture. As well as having a great potential to change attitudes towards disability and mental health on a large scale, advertisements can also reflect and reinforce existing social values, assumptions, prejudices, ideologies, and behaviours. Okay, so now I'm going to discuss pathologizing portrayals of mental health that reinforce the meta-narrative of mental illness. Catherine Martin and Annette Thompson explain that the meta-narrative of mental illness is heavily, in quotes, defined by stigma and shame, against which the individual must work hard to ensure that their more authentic personal narrative is voiced. For instance, in television, film, and literature, people who experience mental distress are typically framed as so-called problem characters who are supposedly possessed by evil or out of control. Meanwhile, newspapers and magazines often portray those who have mental health issues as so-called dangers to themselves and other people, often using stigmatizing terms such as crazed, disturbed, or mental patients. In past advertisements, especially those produced by charities and pharmaceutical companies, pathologizing approaches to mental health issues were promoted in explicit, obvious ways, and they reinforced the misleading and overly simplified insane binary as a key aspect of the meta-narrative of mental illness. And I should point out, by the way, the meta-narrative of mental illness, you might note that the term illness is used, and this is a big part of the meta-narrative, rather than mental health issues, mental and emotional variations or differences. The meta-narrative of mental illness frames mental health issues as illnesses. So for instance, here are two print advertisements on my slide from the 1990s that are promoting Prozac. Prozac is the brand name for the SSRI fluoxetine hydrochloride, which is typically prescribed for people who experience depression and/or anxiety. The advertisements on this slide invoke the meta-narrative of mental illness, which takes a deficit-based approach to mental health issues, framing them as personal failings and misfortunes and tragedies, by using visual metaphors of a shattered object, accompanied by the message, depression shatters, and a grey rain cloud against a black ground with the message, depression hurts. And as I'm sure you can expect, so one of the advertisements where you have the rain cloud and the message depression hurts, on the other side of the advertisement is a bright blue background with a bright yellow sun and the message Prozac can help. As you would expect with direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising, both of these advertisements emphasize that depression is a medical problem. In their words, it's a real illness with real causes that can be fixed by pharmaceutical interventions. Advertisements for prescription-only drugs, such as SSRIs, have been legal since the 1980s in New Zealand and since the 1990s in the United States. And I would suggest that they significantly impact societal attitudes towards mental health issues, as they are presented as trustworthy sources of health information. So there's a lot of misconceptions in New Zealand and the US, for example. So some audiences believe that the government have to approve pharmaceutical advertising to the public, and that's not the case. Often pharmaceutical advertisements as well will refer to research regarding drugs and health, but they contain a lot of assumptions, oversimplified ideas, and so on. So direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertisements are presented as trustworthy sources of health information, despite offering sensationalized and, in Thomas et al.'s words, grossly oversimplified representations. Pharmaceutical advertisements also appear in journals for health professionals, as well as being promoted to the public via mass media. However, they are replete with assumptions and sweeping statements regarding mental health. The role of, in quotes, multinational pharmaceutical giants, which, according to Lemire and DeVille, in quotes, spend twice as much on advertising as on research and development, in promoting the problematic and overly simplified assumption that there are normal and abnormal states of mental health is vast. Okay, so I'm not trying to challenge the way in which some people use medication as a support mechanism. My aim is not to challenge that at all. Rather, what I'm suggesting is that the way in which pharmaceutical advertising implies that prescription drugs are the best or only help available for people experiencing mental health issues is harmful. So, saneism, and if you haven't come across the term saneism before, it's a term that refers to prejudicial, belittling, and stigmatizing attitudes towards people with mental health issues, is reinforced in direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising, particularly in the message that prescription drugs enable people who experience mental health issues to return to normal. The suggestion is that people who experience mental health issues are in need of fixing, and any recognition of empowering counter-narratives that approach madness as a valuable and inherent part of life, as opposed to an illness that needs to be eradicated, are undermined. Now I'm going to turn the focus to anti-stigma campaigns. In recent years, as issues surrounding mental health are gradually, slowly, becoming more widely recognised in society and popular culture, explicitly problematic portrayals of mental health, for example, that overtly promote stereotypes or use stigmatising language, are beginning to decrease. There is also the rising trend of advertising campaigns, and these campaigns are mostly led by public health organisations and charities, but there are also some produced by commercial companies, such as Maltesers' 2021 The Massive Overshare and Maybelline's 2020 Brave Together, that claim to challenge stigma and encourage more conversations surrounding mental health issues. The charities Mind and Rethink initiated a Time to Change campaign, which lasted from 2007 to 2021 and was funded by Comic Relief, the National Lottery Community Fund, and the Department of Health and Social Care in the UK. Time to Change has been described as England's biggest and most ambitious anti-stigma campaign. Advertisements produced as part of the campaign featured well-known celebrities who have spoken openly about their experiences of mental distress, such as television presenter Trisha Goddard, former boxer Frank Bruno, and actress Ruby Wax. The campaign suggests that mental health issues are illnesses that are not a choice and can happen to anyone. So, for example, this slide includes a Time to Change print advertisement, which features a close-up image of Trisha Goddard. The message, "There are no get well soon cards with mental illness," is featured in bold writing just next to the image of Trisha. The smaller text, so this very small text below the image of Trisha, contains quotes from Trisha, who explains how she received less support from people when she experienced depression in comparison to when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. So quotes from the smaller writing include, "When I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I was inundated with get well soon cards. When news leaked out that I was in a psychiatric hospital following a breakdown, not a peep, and certainly no cards. And another quote says, "As Tricia knows only too well, the reactions of other people can make recovery from mental illness even more difficult." Tricia says, "When I tried to talk to people about my depression, they made me feel embarrassed and ashamed. They wouldn't look me in the eye, and that made me feel guilty." Although the Time to Change campaign received lots of media attention and praise, it was actually widely criticised by people who experience mental health issues and mad activists for, in Peter Beresford's words, in quotes, "not going to the heart of the matter, which is actually the psychiatric system, the labelling of people and diagnosing," end quotes. Advertising campaigns such as Time to Change that bring attention to individuals' first-hand perspectives can be effective ways of challenging social isolation and disempowerment that people with mental health issues often experience. Also, celebrities' self-disclosures can promote public acceptance and normalisation of mental health issues as a human condition. However, in a not so different way from the Prozac advertisements that we previously discussed, the advertisement, so Time to Change's advertisement, emphasis on recovery reinforces a simplistic and misleading meta-narrative of mental health. As Margaret Price argues, framing mental health issues as illnesses and recovery as an ideal state that we should work towards promotes an oversimplified, in quotes, discourse of wellness on wellness, and means that support ceases when individuals reach sufficiently well states. MAD studies scholars Bridget McWade, Damien Milton, and Peter Beresford suggest that a key issue with the rising trend of anti-stigma and awareness-raising campaigns that are led by the government and charities is that, in quotes, they appropriate and politically neutralise mad activist concepts such as recovery and hope. Incorporation of mad activism, which reclaims mad identity and challenges the psychiatric and systemic oppression of people described as being mentally ill or having emotional disorders, takes place. So incorporation of these ideas takes place when radical values and activist aims are, in Kane Kanai and Rosalind Gill's words, emptied of their political force and tied back to normative notions of sanity. Although they are often perceived to be forward-thinking, advertising campaigns that emphasise the importance of individuals seeking or offering help to others ignore the ways in which larger social inequalities contribute to mental distress. They also reinforce notions of individualised struggles and tragedies as part of the meta-narrative of mental illness. Rather than radically transforming attitudes towards mental health, focusing on the notion of recovery. And, you know, when you notice advertisements, articles, or when, say, celebrities give interviews and talk about their experiences of mental health, what you will notice is that recovery is mentioned time and time again. So often disclosures of mental health are always accompanied by the reassurance that, but I'm better than I've ever been now. You know, I'm recovering. So when we focus on recovery, it gives the impression, the problematic impression, that people can only experience valuable and meaningful lives when they no longer experience mental or emotional distress. To finish then, I'm suggesting that it's time that we draw on counter-narratives of madness. The popular tendency to emphasise recovery from mental health issues is challenged by those who have survived psychiatric systems and mad activists, as they describe a counter-narrative of recovery as, in quotes, surviving the invalidation from the psychosocial forces that are the source of mental distress. So in other words, mad activists, rather than thinking about recovery as an individual process, recovering from their own minds, they talk about recovering from and surviving invalidating psychosocial forces. Meanwhile, mad activists have coined the term unrecovered to challenge, in quotes, neoliberal intrusion on the word recovery that have been defined and taken over by marketization, language, techniques, and outcomes. And if you want to know more about the concept of unrecovered, you can check out Recovery in the Bin, an activist group. So this is especially important to think about, given that societal understandings of mental health are heavily influenced by the pathologizing, pity and fear-inducing metanarrative of mental illness. Empowering counternarratives recognize that many people actually experience their mental health issues and emotional distress as intrinsic and in some ways enriching aspects of their lives. Lastly, processes of creating counter-narratives of mental health and madness should be shaped by the global movement of mad activists, mad studies scholars, and psychiatric survivors who challenge saneism by framing madness as, in Mohammed Rashid's words, grounds for identity and culture. And to symbolise this notion, I've included an image of a person who is breaking free from chains, and the quote says, "Mad pride." I'll have to just move people's faces out the way to read the quote. "The right to be free, the right to be me." Finally, if you're interested in finding out more about anything that I've talked about, or my research more generally, my email address is houstoe, HOUSTOE @hope.ac.uk. And what I'd ask, if this is okay, and obviously I won't ask for it now, we've got some time for questions, but if anyone wouldn't mind answering 2 questions that I've got via an evaluation form. It's just about the presentation and how it might have made you think, or challenge any assumptions about mental health. If you did have time to complete those 2 questions at some point, I'd be very grateful. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ella. That was absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
Yes, I always learn something new, and I've made lots and lots of notes here. Can I suggest that you copy and paste the link to your 2 questions into the chat?
That's a good idea.
So people can look at that. And yes, we can send that around afterwards. If you haven't got responses in the next couple of days, let me know and I'll send it out to people who are here.
Great. I've just included the link in the chat.
Lovely. And is there anybody who would like to start us off with a question for Ella?
But would it be possible to finish the recording before we have Q&A?
Yes, of course.